Merrimack River, Merrimack, the resilient river. And we meet once a week. We talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. I am Dyke Hendrickson, a journalist and writer. I've just written a book titled Merrimack, the Resilient River. And today is an interesting day because it's a day when a lot of legislators and public servants are having a big meeting on the North Shore to discuss how we can make the river cleaner. That is, of course, they have their own group of people. It's run by the Merrimack Valley River Commission, and also involved is the Merrimack River District Commission. There's more than 200 organizations and entities involved in trying to make the river cleaner. So that's at 3:00. I'm going to go to that. I'm a former newspaper reporter. I'm going to take diligent notes and I will report back. They are trying to figure out how to make the river cleaner and how to get everybody to cooperate, because there is no one organization that can tell people and mandate people to clean up more of the river. Like Haverhill, for instance, the Haverhill sewage treatment plant lets out quite a bit of pollution, and they're trying to do better, but they're not doing better. So all of these boards are trying to work with them and say, come on, we want to clean a river. We have to figure out how to get you money so you can separate the sewage from the water. So anyway, it's going to be a big meeting today, and I plan to go to it. They're going to be, feel that their key is integrated planning for municipal sewage and wastewater. And that doesn't sound very exciting, but that's what you've got. Okay, could you go to the next one? So when we're talking about the river, the Merrimack River, it's about 117 miles long. It goes from central New Hampshire to Newburyport there on the coast. And it has been very dirty over the years. There were textile mills aplenty up there, and not much was done. Even through the 1960s, the word environmental movement or clean water had not been heard. But in 1972, as we will see, the Clean Water Act was passed and the Merrimack River started getting cleaner. Okay, next. The Merrimack River has a significant history going back to the 17th and 18th centuries. This is Newburyport in about the 1850s. And you can see how large the ships were. They're larger than some of the buildings, actually. But there were hundreds of boats, ships built every year. And everyone had a job. If you didn't go out in the vessel itself, you may have made sails or made twine or did some metal work or woodwork. So Newburyport was a thriving community in the 18th and 19th centuries. Next. And this is an example later in the period, 1893. It was, this is one of the last tall ships built in Newburyport, but you can see how large it is. And 300 feet, 500 tons, really enormous. And on the left, you can see some good photos of what it looked like while they were building it. And it was a big day when a tall ship launched, and you can see the women got dressed up. They brought the kids, school let out. And I'm always amazed by the size of it. I mean, there's a horse on the right. You can see in the foreground. The horse is dwarfed by this, and there are many people that came down. Okay, next. And so as things went along, the mills, there were some very good falls on the Merrimack River, including this one in Lowell, and the falls were utilized for hydropower. We're talking about 1820, 1825 now. The first mill in Lowell was built in 1823, and that started, a significant rush towards more capitalists were building mills in the Merrimack. First, there were about a dozen in Lowell, and then they went up downriver to Merrimack and then to Haverhill. They also had used hydropower to run the mills to make textiles, cotton, and wool. And at one time, the Merrimack Valley made more textiles than any other place in the world. And the Merrimack River was the reason they were able to get the power. Next. This is late 19th century, the Spigot River in Lawrence. You can see how many mills there were off in the distance. Each one of those towers suggests a mill. The rivers got very dirty. The fish disappeared. A lot of the wildlife, such as eagles and ospreys and things, disappeared. There was an enormous amount of pollution at this time. Here in the foreground, you can see the train has arrived. And for many years in the 1890s and up through 1930, say, raw cotton would come from the south and on trains, and it would be put into the textile mills here in the Merrimack. Next. The mill clocks, this is a famous shot from Lawrence. This was supposedly the second largest clock in the world, next to Big Ben in London. And it was important to have clocks and timepieces in the mill cities because a lot of the workers could not afford their own watches. So by looking at the clock, they could see, when their shift was starting and how much time they had to get there. Now, thousands of immigrants came to the Merrimack Valley, and it was very helpful for them. And I'm talking late 19th century, early 20th century. Many Jews were thrust out of Russia and Poland. The Irish came. There were Armenians and Albanians and Greeks. So it was very valuable at one time. These people would come, they would find jobs. Later, the jobs were a little dirty and underpaid, but I have my own view on this. It helped many families who were about to, have a bad time in Russia or whatever. They came to this area and they were able to succeed because there were enough jobs. Yes, next. Part of the river, of course, is Manchester, New Hampshire, and the Amesbury Manufacturing Company was once the largest in the world. This is an example of, they always say the mill and the company controlled the town, but here's an example of the river controlling the mill area. This is 1936. It was an enormous flood throughout New England, in Maine and in New Hampshire. And this is, really a dynamic, terrific photo. But in about 1936, a lot of the mills were closing anyway. Strikes were coming to the mills because the workers weren't well paid or taken care of. And also electricity in different ways was coming in. And some of the companies were going south to North Carolina, South Carolina, et cetera, because it was cheaper and there were no unions. But this is an enormous flood and a very big textile works in Manchester. Yes. Here is where the river, you could say the river ends or it begins. I suppose it ends because it's 117 miles long starting in New Hampshire. But for many boaters, it begins here. And you can see this is in Newburyport. The jetties have just been put on in the last 5 years. They were about $20 million of federal money created to enhance navigation. Now, there always has been a bar, and I've read a lot going back to the 18th century, a sandbar in the river. The river's shallow, 12 to 16 foot draw, and at low tide, it's very tough to get over. And many newcomers have had trouble with that. But this is a great shot of the river. You can see many of the boaters are taking the north jetty, trying to get as close to North Jetty as they can because the river will be deeper there. Okay. The Coast Guard has always been a familiar sight in the Merrimack. Here is the station on the Merrimack River. There's a 47-footer in front of you and a couple smaller vessels. There are about 26 coasties at that Newburyport station. Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard in 1790. And people sometimes object to that, but President Lyndon Johnson, in 1965, signed a proclamation saying that Newburyport was the birthplace of the Coast Guard. And we hear a lot about the river getting dirtier, which when it rains hard, it is true. But the river has certainly got many beautiful spots to it. And here's one near the hat factory in Amesbury. You have some boats in the foreground and Maudsley State Park in the background. Next. And here's more of Maudsley. This is a wonderful break for the local area. In the mid-'80s, the state was able to acquire the Maudsley estate. It has about 450 acres. And if you haven't been there, it's wonderful for hiking, for cross-country skiing. They have art in the park in the summer. They have horse. You're able to take your horse there and unload it and ride it. It's really a wonderful spot. And this spring, it has terrific perennials coming out. So the city and the local community was fortunate when they were able to get that, make it a public space. Okay. The river has served in recent years as kind of the centerpiece for some communities that are rebuilding. And here is a shot of Haverhill, and they're doing a good job of rebuilding on the river. On the right, there's apartment buildings and new business offices. Farther down in the center, there's a branch of University of Massachusetts at Lowell, and also Northern New England Community College has classes there. So the river is being used for many things, and one of it is a centerpiece to improve communities. Yep. Here's a wonderful shot up in Lowell. We can't do it this summer or fall because of the COVID, but Lowell has one of the most wonderful and informative national parks in the country. And this national park tells people about the river, about how it was used in the industry, and how locks were created, tributaries were redesigned and sent elsewhere. So it's a wonderful place to be, and you can learn a lot about the Merrimack River from these sessions in Lowell. Again, they're not happening now, but hopefully the COVID will disappear and we'll be able to do those things again. Yes. Many of the shots that we've seen involved textile factories or boating areas, but this is the start of the river in Franklin, New Hampshire. It probably looks much like it did 2 or 3 centuries ago. It's a beautiful spot. There's no development up in this area. And several years ago, actually last year, a group called the Voyagers started here in Franklin, New Hampshire, and they went all the way to Newburyport. It was close to 120 miles, took 4 days. They camped out at night. But this is the beauty where they started. This is a shot of the Nashua River merging with the Merrimack. And I always remember this shot because there are no signs for these things. In Franklin, there's no sign to say the Merrimack River starts here, or here in Nashua, this is where the Nashua and the Merrimack get together. So I was at in the parking lot of a rehab center, and I asked one of the folks, geez, I understand the Merrimack and the other Nashua River merged somewhere. And he said, yep, walk past the parking lot, go through the woods, don't fall over that small cliff, but you'll see it. So here is the merger of the Merrimack and the Nashua River in Nashua. Quite a beautiful spot. And I finally did find it. Thank you. And Enormous Falls in Manchester is still a source of hydropower, and dozens of small electric plants still get their energy from the hydropower of the Merrimack. This city prospered in the 19th and 20th centuries and still is creating energy for the Merrimack Valley. Thank you. And here is another example of harnessing the river. This is in Lowell. To the right, that large building is Umass Lowell. It's a dorm. In the center ground, you can see ways that the river is being held up and monitored. Sometimes they can hold water back when they have no need for it, and other times they'll let it go in gushes, and it powers some of the mills that remain and some of the electrical energy stations that still exist. But this shows you this is a mix of the original stone and a lot of brick from development. Thank you. And Lowell, certainly, like many other communities, really enjoys recreation on the river. Here's a shot this summer. There's fishermen enjoying it. There's a jogger. There's a couple mothers walking babies. And it's a wonderful spot. It's a little cleaner beyond Lowell, I should say. And here's a leisurely day on the Merrimack in Lowell. Thank you. Here's one of a shot from some of the older mills in Lowell. A lot of brick was used. I always keep thinking about this thing. Textiles was big as an industry, but the brick making business must have been also. But if you've been to Lowell, they've redesigned many of their buildings. They're changing and putting shops and schools and many things in. But this is part of the old Lowell. Manchester has done very well. You can see their modern era. They have some of the mills to the right, you can see, and excuse me, they've been repurposed for education, for medical, for restaurants. And in the left, you see some modern buildings, hotels, banks. So Manchester, has been very successful in making the transition from mill town into a vibrant community. Really one of the most prosperous in northern New England. Thank you. We talked a little about the voyagers. These 15 or 20 public officials who came down the river last August of 19. There's Jim Kelcourse in the lead, as it were. He's a state rep from Amesbury. And then there's other people coming down behind. Not too much whitewater in the Merrimack, but they caught some here. And that's Lane Glenn right behind Jim Kelcourse. He is the president of Northern Essex Community College. Thank you. Here's another shot of the voyagers. And sometimes there was whitewater, sometimes it was a little easier to get by. And here's a shot in Lowell. And they're taking a break at the seams. And I'd say 12 to 15 did all the 4 days, but a number of people did 1 or 2 days. And so the voyagers tried to generate publicity about the need to keep the river clean and the need to keep trying to get funding to keep the sewage treatment plants as clean as can be. Thank you. Here's Newburyport Harbor. In recent years, it's been cleaned up. We talked about the Clean Water Act 50 years ago. Now it's pretty clean. And in recent years, a number of boats have come down and settled in. And it's a beautiful spot in summertime. More than 1,500 boats are registered on the Newburyport side and about 500 on the Amesbury-Salisbury side. Thank you. Here's many areas are still very beautiful. Here's the town line, Amesbury and Merrimack. And you can see it's still, I wouldn't say like it was exactly, but there's a lot of beautiful area of the Merrimack that has not been built up. Thank you. Fishing has kind of disappeared. In the summer, we had about 10 boats. There's an enormous amount of permits you have to get, and much has to be done. And here's some of the few boats that still remain in Newburyport on the river. Here's a wonderful shot from the voyagers. Jim Kelcourse in the stern, Diana DiZoglio in the bow. And these are elected public officials who are really working hard to keep the river clean. And they were involved in all of the efforts to make it better. And they were two of the voyagers in the trip we talked about. Thank you. Ed Muskie did a lot. He helped clean up the river in 1972. And let's just move along here if we can. He became a national figure, ran for vice president and later tried to be president. He did not succeed, but he did succeed in becoming the great advocate for clean water. That's his wife, Jane, to the left of his shoulder there. And he, more than any person of the 70s, was the individual that helped clean up the rivers. Paul Tsongas was helpful in his own way, always a champion of the Merrimack. He was from Lowell. He was able to bring the great museum there. And here's another example of the family, Paul Lowell and Nikki Lowell, Paul Tsongas and Nikki Tsongas, and she later served in Congress as well. Yep. He died at 56 in 1997, and here's his memorial along the Merrimack. And we just have one or two more. This is the bridge from Amesbury to Newburyport, which is very valuable. And I think Diana DiZoglio, we did talk about, and going, and I think we have one or two more. I'll end up with this one. We'll end here. I think time is just about out. These are people all work for clean water. You wouldn't expect Richard Nixon in a picture of clean water and environmental graciousness. But in his term, 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency was created, so give him credit. Hubert Humphrey helped clean water and clean air, and Ed Muskie from Maine, as we say, was the architect of the Clean Water Act. So that's it for us. This is Nautical Newburyport. We talk about the river, the Merrimack River. The show is Life Along the Merrimack. This is radio 96.3, Joppa Radio, and Comcast Television. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week.